original Gangsters Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein. We're going to do a life and crimes episode and focus on Ralph Natale, the former Philadelphia Mafia Don turned government informant. Passed away a couple years ago. And I have some unique perspective, I think, to shed on a life and crimes episode of Ralph. I got to know him a little bit at the end of his life. He was one of 3 Philly Mafia administrators that I've sat extensively with, including Joey Merlino and Phil Leonetti. And I worked with Ralph on his book, selling his book, and then I ended up leaving the project after the deal got done. And I'll get into that in a moment. Got nothing but, in terms of a one-on-one personal relationship, I have nothing but positive things to say about Ralph. He was good to me. We bumped heads on a couple things, and that's why I left the project. But I think it turned out the way he wanted it to turn out. Last Godfather standing, or last Don standing. Larry McShane replaced me. Danny Pearson, shout out to Danny and Larry, who are, did a great job with that, and they've always been good to me. So I just wanted to start off by saying that I have no personal animus against Ralph. I liked Ralph. I can see why Ralph was able to kind of come out of nowhere to become a Don, and I think he has a very historically significant story, and that's why I want to focus an episode on him. We used to do these life and crimes, me and my former co-host, and still my best bud, Dr. Jimmy Bucciolato, but I've never tried to do one solo, but I'm going to try to roll one out and see how this goes and see what the feedback is. And again, I thought I'd start with somebody that I knew, I had firsthand personal knowledge of. And again, I think that Ralph was somebody who was a political animal in the world of the mafia. And he was somebody that knew how to play certain cards and use relationships that he had built over the years to manipulate certain outside situations to his benefit. And from being in prison for 15 years, he politicked his way into being the boss of the Philly Mafia, and that takes talent. In some ways, he was his own worst enemy. We'll get into that in a moment. And a lot of miscalculations and self-inflicted missteps, I think, cost him his legacy. And end of the day, I don't think he was a very good mob boss, but I think he was somebody who had the potential to be a very good Mafia Don. And I think he got off to a great start. Somebody that had the wind at his back and was gaining momentum, and then kind of let it slip through his fingers and ended up getting arrested, put back in prison, edged out by the same guys that had helped him get in the Merlino camp, and then flipped. Right after he flipped, he was kind of playing both sides, cooperating with the government and still politicking to the very end. So we'll get into that. So, Ralph came up under, people know this, this is kind of well-worn territory, but since it's a life and crimes episode, we'll hit on all the basics. Ralph, was mentored by a guy named Skinny Razor, Felix DeTulio, AK Skinny Razor, friendly bar, somebody that was not really a legend outside of Philly, but within, the South Philly, North Jersey area. Skinny Razor was a name that needed no introduction. And when people heard that name, when people heard the nickname Skinny Razor, they immediately knew that they were dealing with a major player, a serious individual, and somebody with a lot of muscle behind him. And he was kind of a one-man wrecking crew, even though he had his own crew to run, and had the support of a lot of the old timers, Joe Ida, and then eventually Angelo Bruno. And he mentored both, Ralph and Little Nicky. So he helped, two future Godfathers early in their respective gangland careers, and eventually Ralph, using that street political acumen, worked his way into the good graces of Angelo Bruno, who became Godfather of the Philadelphia organization and LCN organization in '59, and held that role in that job until he was unceremoniously assassinated in 1980. And Ralph was an enforcer, a hitman, a political fixer, a labor union fixer, a guy that controlled the bartenders union, helped Angelo Bruno and La Cosa Nostra control the Teamsters, troubleshooting kind of around the country. And that's where he started to build up that network of contacts. And there's a lot of legitimate critique of Ralph Natale. But one thing you can't take away from the guy is he walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk in terms of being a gangster. He was a cold-blooded gangster who would kill you in the blink of an eye. And he did. He killed two Irish guys for Angelo Bruno, Georgie Feeney, and Joey McGreal. And that helped him build his reputation. And he was an extortion expert. He was a arson expert. He was a drug dealing expert. Eventually got caught up in a firebombing attack. It was an arson fraud. A furniture company was caught in a narcotics transaction that was moving Quaaludes and 10 kilos of cocaine. And I believe he got taken into custody on his boat in South Florida, 1979. It was a year before Angelo Bruno was killed. And he's sent away for 15 years. Now, how and when he got inducted into La Cosa Nostra is I'm going to be kind and say it's a debate. It's really not a debate, but it's, for the sake of the narrative that Ralph was spinning, it was a debate. For people that know, it's not a debate. So Ralph retroactively claimed that he was inducted into La Cosa Nostra by Angelo Bruno, Carlo Gambino in 1966. I'm very skeptical of that. It's one of the reasons that I ended up walking away from the book deal, because I didn't feel comfortable writing that. Based on his 302s and his debriefings and his future testimony in court, he was made by Joey Merlino in a very unconventional path to becoming the boss. where his underboss makes him, and then he declares himself the boss. Nonetheless, he took control of the family, and it was legitimate. And we'll get to, again, we're jumping ahead, but was able to take control of the family with backing of New York through very unconventional means. But I guess if you asked Ralph at the end, when it was all said and done, when he went into prison in 1979, he would tell you that he already had his button and had been made. I don't believe that to be true. I don't believe that facts support that. So I'm going to say, despite what Ralph says, he goes into prison and he's not made. Nonetheless, he uses that political instinct of his and networks his way through the prison system and forges relationships with a lot of different LCN guys, Five Family guys, African-American gangsters, Irish gangsters, the guys that were the Philly Black Mafia that he was dealing with in the drug trade back in the 70s. Their offshoot, which became known as Junior Black Mafia. He was making relationships with those guys. But most importantly, he was building bridges with New York and guys in the Five Families. And that would come into handy in the coming years. So he's about 10 years into his sentence, and stroke of good luck, really, for both of them. In 1989, I think it's the summer or fall of 1989, Joey Merlino is assigned to the same prison compound as Ralph. And Merlino is about 30 years younger. Everybody knows, I'm sure that's why that are watching this, Joey's first, big media splash was the armored car robbery that he had to go do some time for, but pocketed $250,000 or whatever, maybe a little bit, maybe more than that. And just kind of chalked it up to just the cost of doing business. Had to go away and do 3 years. And he's put in a facility where Ralph Natale is. Ralph recognizes that Joey could be an ally, and I think targets him to cultivate a relationship with. According to Ralph, he arranges, sees that Joey's coming into the prison in the days before he gets there, and pays some people off and gets Joey assigned to his unit, becomes a cellmate. And 1989, 1990, 1991, from behind bars, Natale and Merlino become close friends, thick as thieves, and begin plotting to take over the Philadelphia Mafia, under the belief that the boss at that point, John Stamfa, who was a Sicilian put into place by the Gambinos, had been most likely had been part of the conspiracy to kill Angelo Bruno in 1980, had left town, wasn't a guy, wasn't a Philly guy to start with, had been placed there by Carlo Gambino. But with Nicky Scarfo out of the picture, Joey Merlino's dad, Nicky's underboss, Chucky, was one-time underboss Chucky, his last underboss, his nephew, Phil Leonetti. They all get swept off the streets in a big bust from 1987. They're all convicted in 89. We all know Phil goes on and cooperates, but there's a gap to be filled. And since Nicky Scarfo wasn't coming home anytime soon, New York interjects itself. The Gambinos put in John Stamfa. And Stamfa comes to town and establishes a regime. Even before Merlino goes to prison, though, him and Mikey Ciangalini are plotting themselves before Joey even meets Ralph. Mikey Chang and Joey are plotting to take over the city And if that means that they have to go through John Stanfa, so be it. And just like Ralph would go on to use Joey and his guys as the muscle to push his way into the boss's chair, from not even being a made guy, which again that's impressive in itself that he was able to do that. Joey and his crew, which are still, whether Joey is active or not, that's a debate for another day. Most of his crew that fought with him in that war, the 1990s, are still active and running the crime family in the 2020s. And they used Ralph just like Ralph used them. They were able to leverage Ralph's contacts in New York to get the backing they needed to take on Stanfa. They needed someone to co-sign them. And even though Ralph wasn't a made guy, he had the resume of being with Angelo Bruno, Skinny Razor, being with all these New York guys while he was locked up throughout the 80s. And Joey Merlino starts bringing all of his guys to come visit them and introduces them to Ralph. And Ralph, within a matter of a year or two, has all these 30-year-old triggers, guys that have balls, ambition, and now they got the backing of somebody that they can use to take on Stanfa and Mikey Chang and Stevie Mazzone, Georgie Borghese, Marty Angelina, Mikey Lance. They're all, parading to the prison yards to do visits with Joey and Ralph. And the second Joey gets out of prison, Ralph tells him to go to war. And Mikey Chang and Joey go to war with John Stanfa. We don't really need to get into the blow by blow of that war because it's been very, very chronicled on here and other platforms and outlets. So the war goes on 2-3 years. Stanfa and his guys are all locked up in 94, and it just so happens to coincide with Ralph Natale coming out of prison after 15 years, November of 94. Stanfa's out of the picture. Him and Merlino are the last men standing in that war, and they declare victory. And they get the backing of the Genovese, the Colombos. Most importantly, it didn't matter that the Gambinos were backing Stanfa. They kind of outmaneuvered them, getting two of the 5 families to back them against the one that was backing Stanfa. Or I guess you could consider the Lucchese's were in on that too, but that really didn't happen to later on in the decade when the Lucchese's came in and tried to invalidate Merlino. But November 94, Ralph Natale comes out and declares himself boss. Joey makes him. Merlino's becomes the underboss, street boss. Ralph takes the role of Don. And, I think he looked at it as this was the natural order. This was, his version of, natural selection, that he'd always been destined for this. And even though it was via unconventional means, he finds his way into being a godfather. And at first he was very adamant that they were going to follow the rules, that they were going to do things the right way. They were going to treat people the right way. They were going to get respect by giving respect. He wanted to bring a lot of those Stanfa guys that weren't in prison. He wanted to bring them underneath the banner and make peace. He had a very strong relationship again with outside groups, the Pagans Motorcycle Club, the JBM, Junior Black Mafia. Took meetings with those guys when he first came out. Went to New York with Stevie Mazzone to sit down with Mush Russo, who had just become the acting boss of the Colombos. So things really got off to a strong start for Ralph Natale. And if you're looking at, 94 into 95, 96, you'd say that if you were going to, predict the future, that things would work out. Things would work out well for Ralph because, again, Ralph had a really great start. He had all the support you could ever want. He had those Merlino guys, entrenched. They were firmly in Ralph's corner, and they wanted Ralph to lead them. And I think Ralph was somebody who was a great salesman. I could see it when I spent that time with him, and he's someone that in terms of if you were going to make the analogy to a sports coach, he was great at pep talks. He knew how to get everybody riled up and tell them all the things that they needed to hear to go out and play a great game. But from again, making the sports analogy, from an X and O spot, from a tactical spot, he'd get his players all ready to go out and play the game. And then when the game would start, his X and O's weren't X and O'ing. I don't know that's the best way to explain it. But he didn't have the skill set really beyond the pep talks, he was a drug dealer and extortionist, but he didn't have the chops to put stuff together the way the great Dons and Godfathers do. And he sold it that he could. And then that starts to kind of wear thin with the rank and file. And there's house cleaning that needs to be done. Even though he wanted to make peace, there was some people that wouldn't get in line, and they paid with it for their life. They paid for it with their lives. The first that comes to mind is Joe Sedano, who was a capo over in North Jersey, wouldn't report in to Ralph and Joey, said that he wasn't recognizing them. They get Pete the Crumb Caprio to bang him out, and then Pete becomes skipper of that Jersey crew. You had the Tura family that was like an independent group that was in a mini war faction battle with Merlino and Natale. Natale had grown up with the elder of that group. You had a guy named Tony Machines who was in the gambling machine business that wouldn't get in line. So you had the VC hit, John VC's brother, who was killed when John was testifying. So bodies are dropping. People are getting in line in terms of everybody outside the organization because people realize that Ralph, again, there was a lot of things he wasn't, but one thing he was a killer. And if you didn't do what he told you to do, he was going to kill you. And he was doing that. So that kind of got everybody in line. The issue was, as everybody was starting to toe the line on the streets, internally, things started to fray, and trust and rapport between the older generation, Ralph, and the younger generation, Joey Merlino and his guys, starts to deteriorate and it erodes. A lot of it had to do with Ruthie, who was Ralphie's girlfriend, who he met through his daughter, and she was a contemporary of Joey and his guys, and their relationship just didn't play well. And as much as Ralph didn't want to see it or acknowledge it, and I'll get to that in a second, the relationship really undermined him, and in some ways was his undoing. Trying to act hip as a 60-year-old, running around with a 30-year-old, and in some ways the 30-year-old is, kind of pulling Ralph around by the nose. And guys started to kind of lose respect for him because of the way that Ruthie treated him and the way that Ralph demanded that the Merlino guys treat Ruthie, someone that was, they had grown up with on the street corners of South Philly. All of a sudden, they're being asked to treat her like she was the first lady, or she was Princess Diana, or Britney Spears. She was she was all of a sudden a queen, and she was also being brought to events where girlfriends weren't really supposed to be present. That upset some of the wives. And really, at the end of the day, again, Ralph wasn't delivering on a lot of the stuff he was pitching. He wasn't able to put together a lot of great underworld business deals in the boardroom or even on the streets. He got his hooks into the mayor of Camden, which was something that he was never really able to get that moving, pretty quickly. That all fell apart because of his arrest, and that didn't really maximize that. And it was a situation where, as time went on, intentionally, unintentionally, he was being alienated from his guys. And more, his guys were doing things, meaning the Merlino guys were doing things without Ralph's knowledge, without Ralph's say-so. And even before things started to go bad, they weren't telling Ralph everything that they should have been telling him. They were intentionally mixing up facts in some of the hits they were doing, and some of the jobs that they were assigned, telling Ralph that certain guys were on certain hits when they were actually on other hits, to just kind of muddy the waters. And if it ever came to the point where Ralph was on the witness stand, he'd look stupid. So it was a long play that worked out in the end. And again, we'll get to that in a moment. And really, the last straw was the last straw in terms of him losing the family, metaphorically, losing the trust and the faith of his capos and cabinet and soldiers, was a night out in the town. They were all at the saloon. George Anastasia writes about this in his book, but I've gained more context from my reporting since that book came out. Again, it's that book, The Goodfellas, the Anastasia trilogy of Blood and Honor, Last Gangster, and the Goodfellas tapes is as good as it will ever get. And that's the church that I pray to as a mob journalist. That is the Holy Grail, those three books. And it lays the foundation for everything that I do and report. But there was a altercation. Everybody's at the saloon. Ralph and Ruthie get into a spat because I guess Ralph is paying attention to another female. And Ruthie hit Ralph in public. And that was really the end in terms of his guys having the respect that a boss needs. And I think that was in either 97 or 98. Ralph didn't last through the summer of 98. He's scooped up on a violation of his supervised release in June of 98. But this Ralphie thing, or I should say this Ruthie thing with Ralph, was a real undoing, and something that also led to me leaving the book project. And in addition to me not feeling comfortable telling people that Ralph was made in the 60s by Angelo Bruno and Carlo Gambino, just on a quick aside, I mean, if that was true, then he lied to the FBI in his 302s. He lied on the stand. So everything he said on the stand was perjured, if that's true, if it's true that he was made in the 60s. And I don't believe that's possible, because if he got caught lying, the whole deal would have been out the door. So there was that. And then there was the Ruthie thing where Ralph didn't want to, and I don't believe he does in Last On Standing. Ralph did not want to address the Ruthie situation. He felt it was disrespectful to his wife. I mean, in my opinion, the disrespect had already been accomplished. I mean, had already been done, not accomplished. It's not something I don't think he wanted to do. But by engaging in the affair in the first place is disrespectful to your wife that waited for 15 years with you locked down. And then the second you get out, you go scurry towards a younger woman because you can. And I felt like you had to address it. Even if you were going to not own it, you had to address it. And that was really the biggest issue, I think, that I had with Ralph in terms of, again, this wasn't personal. I liked Ralph a lot. He was very nice to me. He was he comes off, he's charismatic. He has magnetism. He's a natural salesman, in some ways a natural leader. But there wasn't a lot of self-introspection. There wasn't a lot of owning his mistakes or acknowledging, hey, I did this and this was the wrong move. I should have done this. And I think that in terms of me working with him and putting together his autobiography, I felt like if that's missing, then you're just not being truthful. On the other hand, Ralph had a very high opinion of himself. And maybe even deep down inside, if he felt like he made mistakes, he wasn't going to acknowledge them. And he was going to kind of die on that hill, that he didn't do anything wrong, that wrong was done to him. And can't really see how certain decisions put him in the position where that was done to him. There was also a debate between him and I about Joey Merlino and how much Merlino should be in the book. And he was saying, as little as possible. And I was like, no, as much as possible. Everybody wants to know about Joey. So that was another issue we had. But again, I want to just keep on reiterating. Ralph was really good to me and on a personal level. And I really enjoyed my time with Ralph. And I left the project and I have no regrets. And they ended up writing the book that they wanted to write. But I just, from a personal perspective, I got nothing but positive things to say about him. So he gets violated in 98 in June. And, very shortly thereafter, the Merlino guys wiped their hands of him and cut him off. And from talking to guys that were at the saloon that day, the year before that, or months before that, and I'm not condoning this. I would never condone a murder or homicide or any violence at all towards anybody, let alone a woman. But I think the belief was, after she smacked him in public, after Ruthie smacked Ralph in public in front of all of his men, I think the belief was he needs to go and kill her, or he'll never get back to good with us. To let a woman disrespect you like that, who's not your wife, and somebody that is like the contemporary of your guys, it didn't bode well for him. And it was another reason that they kind of felt like they didn't need him anymore. He had served his purpose, and they cut him off. And by 99, he's really on his own. Merlino's is picked up on a drug case in the summer of 99, and Ralph ends up cutting his cooperation deal before the end of the year, becomes the first official Mafia Don in American history to make a deal with the government and agree to testify. What's something that has really, I think, only been reported by me, and something that I want to go back into and reiterate, that even after that deal was struck, Ralph was still playing both sides of the fence. He was cooperating, cobbling together a historic deal with the government where he would testify, debrief, and break his oath to La Cosa Nostra. He said that he had a premonition, and that premonition was he's got to leave the family, the crime family behind, and focus on his real family. That he owed it to them for the last chapter of his life to dedicate it to his real family, not La Cosa Nostra. I would say that the circumstances that he faced, he didn't have much choice. But as 99 goes into 2000, before the big Philly racketeering case drops and gets everybody else, Merlino's in there on the drug case, but the rest of them don't get picked up until spring of 99, or late spring, early summer of 99. I should say, I apologize, I'm messing up the time. Spring of 2000, Ralph is plotting with Pete the Crumb Caprio. Ralph behind bars, Pete the Crumb out in New Jersey as a skipper and working for Merlino's acting boss, Uncle Joe Legambi. And Georgie Borghese was still out at that point. Stevie Mazzone was still out, underboss and consigliere. And even though he's working a deal with the government, Ralph is secretly communicating with Pete the Crumb and trying to help Pete the Crumb push out the Merlino regime by killing Joe Legambi, Stevie Mazzone, and George Borghese at what was supposed to be a meeting in New Jersey. Ralph helped Pete the Crumb get some backing from New York. I don't think New York, maybe even Pete the Crumb at that point, knew that Ralph was cooperating. So he's playing both sides of this. And part of the Genovese crime family and the Gambinos are backing Caprio to kill off the Merlino leaders that are left on the street and take over himself. And Ralph is helping arrange that. Caprio gets busted before the deal, before the purge can occur. Luckily for Legambi and Borghese and Mazzone and Merlino. And Ralph goes on to testify for the government in the big 2001 Philly mob racketeering trial that was just, kind of a real event, a place to be and be seen that summer of 2001, and ends up not being that successful of a witness. Although all the Merlinos are, all the Merlino group is convicted on racketeering counts, none of the murders stick. And there were about a half dozen murders that Ralph testified to ordering and giving the contracts out to the Merlino guys, but couldn't properly put all the facts together because Merlino and his guys were feeding him lies and made him look stupid on the stand. And at the end of the day, they didn't get him on the murders. And that made the government mad at Ralph. And they knew about what Ralph was doing because in 2000, because they were listening on the phone calls. And they knew that he was trying to backdoor them and help Pete the Crumb kill a bunch of people to take power. for Pete the Crumb. I think for Ralph, he realized that it was over for him, but just out of spite to the Merlino guys, he wanted to help. They wanted to help Caprio. Really at the end of the day, the Merlino guys got the last laugh because Ralph, despite turning on them, testifying against them, pointing the finger at them for multiple murders, Ralph did more time than any of them. Ralph did 13 years. Joey did 12. Georgie did 13 also, but based on another case that he took, he had to fight the case for his last couple years inside. But everybody else did all shorter sentence than Ralph. And the guy that he was trying to jam the hardest, Joey Merlino, did a year less than him. Merlino comes out and went in a year later than he did and comes out 6 months, 5 months before him in 2011. So Ralph lived quietly his last years, passed away a couple years ago. I was sad to see that he had died. And I really wish him and his family the best. I'm just trying to be authentic and as accurate and as historically relevant as the situation is. I think it's a very significant piece of history when it comes to LCN, when it comes to the Philly family, the Bruno Scarfo family. So as much as I like Ralph personally, I had to call it like it is, call the balls and strikes of it. And at the end of the day, Ralph wasn't a great boss. Again, I thought that he could have been. But you got to live and die with the decisions you make when you're playing in the big leagues. And he made some bad decisions, and it ended up biting him. He did get to live the last decade of his life free and with his family. And I know that was really rewarding for him. And the Merlino guys are still out in some cases, thriving. I mean, Merlino himself has seen better days. We know about that, the back and forth with New York and the podcast. And again, he's as resilient as anyone has ever been in the history of LCN. He'll be fine. In a couple of years, he'll be back on the upswing. A couple more years, he'll be back on the upswing. I'd buy stock in him and hold that stock. Because I don't care how low the stock is right now, I would buy it because he's the genuine article and he'll be fine. But Ralph Natale, that was kind of life and crimes of him and breaking down my personal relationship with him. I hope they eventually make the movie. I know that there was a announcement that the Last Don Standing was optioned for a film, and Frank Grillo was going to play Ralph. I love Frank Grillo. He's great on the Tulsa King this season. So if that ever happens, that'd be great. But from a personal standpoint, I got nothing but love for Ralph. But for breaking down his career and his legacy, it was a roller coaster, and it was really bumpy, and it was a unconventional rise and a pretty dramatic fall. And to the point where he joined Team USA and broke a glass ceiling, because after him, Joe Massino flipped, and you had bosses. I think kind of felt like the line had been crossed and there was no going back. And if one boss can flip, then another boss can flip, and that's what happened in the 80s. The more guys cooperate, the more desensitized people become to the cooperation, and you can do your kind of mental gymnastics and convince yourself why it's okay to flip. But Ralph was the first official boss ever to make that decision, and it really, it primed the ground for what Joe Massino would do less than 5 years later, or about 5 years later. So Original Gangsters Podcast, Scott Burnstein. I hope you guys are liking the new approach to content, a little bit longer, a little bit more in depth, a little more historical. Please like, share, and subscribe. Original Gangsters Podcast. I'm Scott Burnstein, uncovering the underworld, one city, one region, one country at a time. I'm out.